So I'm delighted that my colleague and friend and collaborator, Paul Nesbitt Larking, is giving a talk today called Imagining the Post-COVID Polity, Narratives of Possible Futures. And he's also joined by Professor Jim McCauley. Professor Paul Nesbitt Larking is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Huron University College in Canada and former president of the International Society of Political Psychology. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Studies here at Queen's. His publications include Contemporary Orangism in Canada, 2018, the Palgrave Handbook of Global Political Psychology, and the Political Psychology of Globalization, Muslims and the West. He'll be presenting today's talk, but he is joined with his collaborator and co-author, Professor James McCauley. Professor McCauley, Jim, is a professor of political sociology and Irish studies at the University of Huddersfield, UK. He is a visiting research fellow at Huron University College, co-editor of the Political Psychology, the journal, and has written extensively in the areas of political violence, terrorism, and political party membership. His publications include the Democratic Unionist Party, 2014, Very British Rebels, 2016, and the Ulster Unionist Party. I am thrilled to welcome them both, and I'll turn the stage over to Professor Nesbitt Larking. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Jonathan for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming to the virtual room today. I'd particularly like to welcome my colleague and co-author, Jim McCauley, from the University of Huddersfield, who has, with great effort and energy, stayed up very late across the Atlantic. And it's good to see you, Jim. And I'm looking forward to this presentation of our work and also a conversation, hopefully, about some of our findings and some of the thoughts that people have. I'm going to spend a few minutes describing the study and presenting a few preliminary findings, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. Well, Jim and I are not alone in trying to understand how the global pandemic has been affecting existing social structures and political societies, or polities, that we live in. Whatever else can be said, the pandemic is universal, it's deeply experienced, and it's transformative of daily routines and social relationships. As with all transformations on this scale, involving the fate of broadly democratic polities, such as Canada, there are going to be dangers and there are going to be opportunities. It's possible to see in the current circumstances and response to them the seeds of tyranny, despotism, and authoritarianism on the one hand, or revitalized democracies, pluralism, more equitable systems on the other hand. And we don't attempt to predict or even speculate about whether responses to the pandemic will move polities in a generally more authoritarian or democratic direction. Instead, what we do is bring together our frameworks of understanding based on analyses of social structures, social relations, with evidence of what others have been thinking about concerning where polities are headed as we emerge from the pandemic. Well, we identify 5 broad interrelated developments that have emerged throughout the pandemic. First of all, the pandemic has rapidly and profoundly revealed the critical importance of evidence-based and scientifically grounded information, as well as the need for rationality and systematic order in the provision of public health and other services. Second, there's been a move in some societies toward greater egalitarianism, with the state intervening to protect and enhance the social wage through bolstering those parts of the economy that are essential to life, notably health, employment, housing, education, and basic income support. This involves a major cultural shift, placing a different or perhaps renewed set of values at the heart of the economy and the society, and reaffirming the dignity of socially necessary labor, as well as care for those who've been temporarily displaced from work or are unable to work. Third, there's evidence of overt recognition by the state that the economy and the social order have been seriously destabilized and that intervention is necessary. Whether this is with a view to re-establishing neoliberalism and the free market in the end, or some form of transformation through socialization and or decommodification is uncertain. But also we can say that widespread uncertainty, fear, and anxiety have reawakened the state as the more or less legitimate guarantor of order. Fourth, there's been a reaffirmation of the notion of community, resting on notions of solidarity and mutual aid. Here, the state takes a diminished or perhaps a complementary role. Individuals and small groups are recognized, affirmed, encouraged, and enabled to organize support and care within their local communities. Finally, the role of the state and community animation have reawakened tendencies toward participative and deliberative democracy to those forms of structures in society. Well, taking these five broad developments together, we ask ourselves how far the recently ascendant populist regimes remain viable. As we've said, our five interrelated pandemic developments may be used in the service of greater pluralism and open democracy on the one hand, or greater authoritarian control on the other. However, each one in its own way is antithetical to populism as a viable leadership followership style. Contemporary right-wing populism is based on irrational, anti-scientific, personalist, often arbitrary and unequal values, claiming to address those left behind from the era of neoliberalism. Populist responses to the pandemic are reflected directly in calls to close borders, extensively curtail or end immigration, expel migrant workers, overtly defend national sovereignty, reject multiculturalism, and restrict international cooperation and development. Populism's taken on board anti-elite, anti-science perspectives of libertarian versions of individual freedom in the context of post-truth networks of communication and motivated reasoning. Ironically, populism stands in opposition to critical political participation or involvement. It is centralized and it depends on spectacle, as can be seen in the conduct of leaders such as Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, Orban, and others. During the contemporary crisis, these leaders and others have claimed to embody the will of the people and speak on its behalf, even as they fail to achieve concrete results and strongly resist scrutiny. As a regime type, demagogic populism is limited in duration, as it's fundamentally premised on fraud, sleight of hand, deception, overt attempts to generate and reinforce direct connections between the people and a political leadership that claims to stand against a positioned political elite. Of course, these views have been seductive. Populism's rapidly become highly successful in these circumstances, but its very superficiality renders it necessarily finite, and it cannot ultimately resolve the very challenges which originally gave rise to it. It easily falls victim to the onset of real and concrete crises. Populism is dramatically unsuited to the challenges of crisis management, and when confronted with practical problems, it falls apart rapidly. Thus, the demise of populist regimes will have been radically catalyzed and accelerated through the impact of the global pandemic. They're not over yet, of course. However, we're not arguing that populism as a social and political force is dead. Ideologies don't die. At most, I think we might say that populism has been displaced by circumstances in most places, but available for realization in the future whenever circumstances change. So that's a brief description of our understanding of contemporary social structures and relations in the pandemic. But in order to assess how far others share our perspectives, we wanted to find a way of tapping into the thinking of opinion leaders, in particular journalists, writers, public intellectuals, and other commentators whose writings reflect and shape contemporary cultures. We decided to explore the predictions, that is, ideas about what the polity will become, and prescriptions, that is, what it should be, found in the writings of those who have been developing narratives in thinking about the post-COVID world. The presence and substance of such narratives begins to address the question of how far the expectations that Jim and I have are to be found in stories that Canadian and other writers are telling each other about what might be and what should be the nature of our polities as they emerge from the pandemic. Well, in order to explore the themes and perspectives of narratives that have been operational in the COVID period, we've run a database search of the Canadian Periodicals Index from February the 29th, 2020 to July the 31st, 2021. We searched a series of terms using a keyword search related to COVID, pandemic, and coronavirus. You can see that we had a total of 2,227 articles that were generated from news sources, magazines, academic journals. And we started by limiting this number, excluding those that were duplicates, fewer than 300 words, those that were written in French. There were a few of those in here. And obviously also excluding those that when we scanned them were overtly and clearly not related to either predictions or prescriptions about the post-COVID polity. This resulted in a final total of 228 articles, or just over 10% of the original number. In the second stage of analysis, we then took the discourse analytical software program NVivo, and we coded the 228 articles into a series of nodes. And in the second table, we can see that the resulting nodes generated the illustrated narrative materials that we will then subsequently draw upon in our analyses. The columns in the table specify both the sources, that is the individual articles, and the references, that's extracts of text from articles that express predictions and or prescriptions related to our study. Predictions and prescriptions that did not describe the post-COVID polity were excluded. For example, several sources that we looked at, quite a number actually, were interested in travel and tourism trends, destinations, where people were going, business sales trends and preferences after the pandemic. These, of course, are of interest to many, but they weren't of direct interest in our study. So of the 228 articles that we selected for further scrutiny, 112, or just under 50%, were of substantive interest. And this is indicative that the developments and the trends that we had considered in the early party analysis also held something of a place in public discourse. As we can see in the table, a number of general points are clear. When it came to publication of narratives concerning the post-COVID polity, there was no widespread consideration of either science and rationality or democracy and participation. They were there in some measure, but they weren't there in as many cases as the other nodes that we investigated. And this perhaps isn't surprising. These are rather abstract and academic concepts, perhaps, so that their relative absence in journalistic coverage is perhaps not surprising. But the other three areas all received some substantial coverage, and notable here are the number of prescriptive narratives on social equality and the welfare state, as well as a number of predictive narratives concerning the local and community-based characteristics of post-COVID societies. A number of narratives envisaged a more permanent arrangement of people working from home and decentralizing the workplace, with many of the other follow-on consequences of that, with all the challenges and opportunities that are associated with something as complex as moving the workplace from centralized locations to people's domestic space. There were also three areas that we hadn't developed explicitly in our own initial framework, but came to be of interest to us, and so we recorded them. These were to do with the environment, and that, of course, is related in part to science and rationality, to a sense of global or cosmopolitan narratives, many of them aspirational about a global community, and related to this, to the spiritual and or the religious. Now, getting to the level of the narratives themselves, narratives in political agency are always and everywhere more than simply nice stories. They serve to align memory and recognition. They privilege understandings. They shape identities. They define in-groups and out-groups. And they promote expectations of the future. They're the schema and the scripts through which most people recall political knowledge, develop their political identities, and most importantly, motivate and animate the sense of the possible in political participation. There's only time, I think, in this presentation to briefly illustrate some of the predictive and prescriptive narratives that we found in our search through the Canadian Periodicals Index. But I thought it would be useful to illustrate a little bit. So I'm just going to conclude the presentation that I'm going to make today with three extracts. Let's start with this one from Paul Taylor in the Toronto Star, dreaming of a post-pandemic world of wage increases and workplace equity. He says, I'd rather talk about how we're continuing to shortchange vital workers while Canada's wealthiest CEOs are earning record incomes. Surely our dreams of post-pandemic work should address this widening gap. As it stands, dignity, protection, and decent wages for frontline workers are still an afterthought. And of course, the implication there is that they shouldn't be. The second extract is another prescriptive piece, a prescriptive narrative that prescribes and envisages a stronger social infrastructure in which state and society contribute to reducing inequalities and injustices, creating a world that's resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. And the authors here say public policy and finance are understandably focused on resilient recovery and rebuilding, with unprecedented investments in physical infrastructure to create green jobs that address the imbalance between humanity and the natural environment. To fulfill the potential of this great transition, our social infrastructure needs attention too. Social infrastructure includes policies, practices, and relationships that enable us to create a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable society from the grassroots to the global, and spanning healthcare, education, culture, and our democratic processes. COVID-19 has revealed systematic injustices and vulnerabilities, including institutionalized racism, substandard seniors housing, the lack of paid sick leave and inadequate childcare. To this list, we can add Indigenous reconciliation, the income and wealth gap, and the life and budget sapping increases in chronic disease. And one final slide that this time talks to a predictive narrative. And this one comes from The Economist magazine. And it's related to the local and to the communitarian. Mainly a new balance to be found as individuals and companies seek to meld continuous online connections with an adequate exposure to the physical serendipities and contacts of city life. Office attendance will become a memory for some, a daily delight for others, and a movable feast for most. This will encourage a new sort of sprawl. Living near the heart of the city, which has long seemed worth it in terms of high property prices and rents, and therefore small apartments, because of job opportunities and amenities are so valuable. If the daily tide of commuters weakens, so will some of those benefits, because the customer base will have shrunk and the attraction of moving somewhere larger will grow. So there are three extracts from the 112 or so that we coded and put into the table that I showed you earlier. So let me conclude. When it comes to the mainstream and mostly Canadian sources of newspapers, magazines, and journals, we can detect a substantial range of predictions and prescriptions that relate in particular to equality and equity, a more robust role for the state, and a return in some ways to the local and the communitarian. It's clear that there is some considerable engagement with how we take the challenges and exigencies of the present and build them into something that is better for us. We understand, of course, that we've been restricted to fairly mainstream media, that social media and other internet sources may well take us in a different direction. That, of course, is beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. We are going to be returning to our data, and I'm very much hopeful that you and others will be able to give us some guidance as to what we can be looking for as we go back to the data. Because we'd like to both try to confirm, but to refine our analyses. The thing about narrative analysis is that it's potentially never over. You always can go back to the data, it's very rich. It's clear that most of the narratives are positive and progressive. Of course, by definition, reactionary narratives don't always have a lot to say about the future beyond calling for a sort of return to a mythologized past. So we're going to be looking to assess how far it is the case that the orientations, the positionings of these are positive and progressive. And we're also going to be paying some more detailed attention to trying to pick out narrative threads that currently lie beyond our frame. So that's it from me at the moment. I'm going to turn things back now to Jonathan, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. I see Jim has unmuted himself. Maybe I'll turn the floor over to Jim.
Thanks, John. I have very little to add. Thank you, Paul, for that. I think it sums up where we are wonderfully well. Just to point out that, I'm this is mainly about the Canadian situation, and I'm very happy for Paul to present that. I think there are huge parallels with the situations in the UK. There are also some subtle differences, but largely we're talking about a reconstruction of the state-community relationship. So, for example, in the UK, in the very early days of the academic, there was a lot of things in the press about people saying, we're never going to return to the way it was before. Things have got to change. We've got to pay the nurses' shoes wages, and so on and so on. Those have all been marginalised and pushed to the edge of populist discourse, and really the state has absorbed those criticisms, if that's what we want to call them, thoroughly over the last 18 months, and so there are connections between the two societies. But thank you, Paul. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, at this point, I would like to open it up to the others here in the room. And if you have a question, there's a number of ways we can field the questions. You can use your Q&A button at the bottom. You can also raise your hand. I'm comfortable with that. If you are comfortable with asking the question, either with or without your camera on. So I'll open up the floor. While I'm just waiting for the question, maybe I'll abuse my moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. I am absolutely fascinated with your data and your findings. And the first thing that comes to mind is this choice of predictive versus prescriptive, which I find really interesting. And as you, of course, said, predictive is what will become, and prescriptive is what ought to be or what should be as normative dimension. So I guess my question is, why those two? Why did you choose those two narratives? And I guess related to that, and it's something Paul just touched on towards the end of his presentation, I'm really interested in sentiment. So in your review of the narratives, did you find a greater or lesser positive or negative sentiment among those various categories that you presented? And did any of that surprise you? So I'll leave it there for now.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for those very important questions. Let's go to the first one about the prediction and prescription. This actually came from the data. When we were doing an initial analysis of the data, our initial thought was, well, we're interested in what people think in general about the post-COVID world. How do they sketch this? How do they create dreams of this? What are they envisaging? And what became clear to us is that there were at least two major ways of looking at it. And some people said, well, in the future, people will X, Y, and Z. So they made predictions. And other people said, just as Jim has alluded to, we've been living with something for a long time. This is an opportunity to change. We must do better, or that kind of concept. And that last comment from me, I think, illustrates the answer to your second question, which is that the vast majority of the narrative threads that we were able to look at were positive and progressive in note, and very few were negative or seeking to return to some former state. What I also said at the end was that we want to go back and comb through these data again, precisely with the kind of fine treatment that you mentioned of sentiment and other related concepts, to actually see in greater detail what we can discover. But our first brush of the data says that a very large number of people are looking in a sort of fairly progressive and positive way when they're thinking about the future.
Thank you. Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
I think people are having problems hearing me at the moment. I'm just going through it again, trying to get my microphone working a bit more clearly. So I'll come back to you if I may.
Okay.
I'm trying to respond in the chat box if anyone's interested.
So there's a question from in the Q&A from Hugh Siegel, who asks, how comfortable is Professor Nesbitt Larking with textual analysis as a solid indicator of what the population as a whole might be thinking or anticipating? What is the danger of those who write in the public domain not being reflective of the broader population?
Well, that's a great question, and a very broad one too. Media people have been asking this for a very long time. If my first answer is to say simply, if people who write in popular publications, in newspapers, in journals, do not have their finger on the pulse of where people are or where they would wish to be, then they are probably not going to be very successful. So there is no direct sense in which people, the popular mood is mirrored. Another thing that I could say, I think, is that, I was alluding to some of the sort of reactionary, some of the sort of other perspectives of where we are and where we might go. Many of those have, and this is why I mentioned social media, many of those have been pushed to places beyond the mainstream, and that's probably where they're going to be found. But I hesitate to exaggerate the importance of those. They certainly are ones that are notable, and people who are engaged in the analysis of social media will certainly say that they make a lot of, they create a lot of an emphasis, they create a lot of noise. Whether the range of perspectives that is discovered through this and textual analysis of the Canadian Periodicals Index faithfully represents the perspectives and the viewpoints of the broader Canadian public, I would have to say, on the whole, probably it's a reasonable place to begin looking for that. That said, if we restrict the analysis, as we have done, to prescriptions and predictions, then also I would say we're probably looking for people who are trying to write in more of a kind of leadership role, people who are writing with perhaps a view to persuading people and to changing people's minds. So another question would be, in doing the analyses, to see how many of these resources, how many of these narratives are included in pieces that are opinion pieces, that are broader discussions, features, and so on, and how many are just sort of simply news stories. So you raised a very big question there, and I've tried to address some aspects of it, but I think there's a lot more to be said.
Jim, did you want to add anything to
that? Just in the UK, in the initial period, there was quite a lot of self-help groups, and a return to the community and a return to the community as a basis for organisation. So we had quite a lot of WhatsApp groups being set up locally and in different communities around, and they actually began to talk to each other. And sometimes it was, where can I get a pint of milk? But sometimes they developed slightly to what they saw, how they saw society going. Now, again, they faded out quite quickly. Within a year, that they were almost non-existent. But that initial surge, I thought, was very interesting in terms of what was going on. And there was a real shift away from the state to community as a point of organisation. And I know one village around here, I'm in Yorkshire, was actually producing a community newsletter, and people were talking about copying that, and it wasn't, again, part of it was, where can I get a pint of milk? But other parts of it were sort of editorial as well. And there didn't seem to be, I mean, normally in the UK, those sort of things are taken over quite quickly by certain groups. That didn't seem to be happening. So, I mean, I personally found that a very positive period of lockdown, but it didn't last. And I suppose we have to ask why it didn't last.
That's interesting. So, you know, to just add on to Hugh Siegel's question, I mean, your findings could be buttressed by comparing public opinion data over the course of your analysis and looking at general levels of support for social equality and the role of the state. And I think it might be interesting to see if there is, as the assumption in the previous question suggests, an increase of level of support for those two things. You know, Jim, one of the, in the example you just gave, you suggested, and Paul also alluded to, the increasing role of communitarian values and community as important. And you conclude from that about the role of the state. Could it be argued that, in fact, this is evidence of a failure of the state, that folks are looking more locally because they're not seeing what the state needs to deliver, and that's being reflected in news coverage?
I think that's exactly what was happening here. And again, you know, I'd be interested to hear what the parallels are between the two countries. But in this part of the UK, certainly, I think that's exactly what was happening. There was more or less a feeling of the state, you know, cannot do this. We're going to have to try and do it for ourselves. Now, I'm not kind of suggesting, you know, the UK was suddenly becoming full of anarchist communes, but at some level, the movement, the state was being challenged as to its role, and the state was being challenged as to whether they were the most efficient providers of things other than you know, health and the vaccinations. So I think that's exactly what was happening. Yeah. But it was fairly short-lived. So, you know, one month we were out cheering for the nurses every Thursday, and people were saying the nurses have to be, you know, rewarded for this, and there has to be changes and a reorganization of society, and people were actually articulating in those ways. You know, a couple of months later, they were given a 1% pay rise, and nobody said very much about it, other than, you know, that's not right. But there was no level of organisation around it. So yeah, it was all fairly short term, and you know, as for the other things Paul was talking about, you know, are we going to go see a change in work, and are we going to see a change in society? Well, you know, we're going back to full working mode this Thursday. Is it this Thursday? Next Thursday? One of the two, where we're no longer supposed to work at home. You know, my university is expecting us to go in and give face-to-face lectures and so on. You know, again, there hasn't been a great deal of resistance to that. So I think we also have to not just compartmentalize it, but we have to look at what period of time we're looking at these events throughout the epidemic.
Just, I can only add to that in response to some of the questions that you had earlier, John, there could be, and you know, it's possible to trace a kind of dialogue and dialectic between the state and forms of civil society, of people acting in community. And one of the interesting questions is how far, as we move through the pandemic, will a reinvigorated series of communities push and prompt improvements to state provision and to public policy. So that's and to me that's an open question, and I don't know what the response to that would be, but it's interesting to me to think about that as a kind of mutual relationship. And also, of course, state actors can be animators in their own communities, and local activists can become members of the state. So there's this kind of constant reciprocity, and I wouldn't want to draw too strong a distinction between the two.
Thank you for that. So, well, let me just ask then another question about your 5 categories. I'm interested in deliberative democracy, and you tantalizingly said one of your 5 themes was a reinvention of democracy through deep participation and deliberative reasoning. Can you tell me a little bit about how that was manifest in the articles you reviewed?
In terms of the content of the Canadian Periodical Index, yeah, I think, you know, that people, I would have to go back and look to the actual individual sources, but one of the strands of these narratives would be people talking about a growing demand for something better from the political class and something better from politicians when it comes to public provision. So that would be one of the things that was definitely in there. And I don't think that I don't recall there being anything specifically about articles about deliberative democracy with respect to the pandemic, but certainly a kind of call for the democratic system to be deeper and richer and more reflective of the views of the communities that that was definitely there.
Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't. I mean, Paul's much more knows the Canadian literature much better than I do, so I don't think I have anything to add to what Paul said, to be quite honest.
So one of your categories was in one of the first slides you had on your categories of articles was social equality. And I noticed quickly that the N of articles, the number of articles in that was the same as a category that you called craft product. That seems really intriguing. Tell me a bit about that. So,
that was sort of articles that talked about people creating local businesses particularly, and you know, taking the opportunity to build locally and produce with often in environmentally sustainable ways local products, and to use this to animate you know, local economies, people helping each other in terms of local sourcing and that kind of thing. And related to that was kind of craft production.
Which is also reflected, Paul, in that initial wave in the UK about doing things in the community.
Yeah.
The problem is that, you know, many of the communities that I'm aware of, all the older small firms have gone bust, and the firms that were created by the Conservative government during the epidemic with money, they're rapidly running out of money. So you know, I think something will happen at that point. I'm not quite sure what will happen at that point, but all those localized, community-based startup companies is what we call them here. I'm not sure if that translates. Are not going that well, and you know, so it's difficult to say what will happen because, as you've probably picked up, Boris Johnson is under a fair amount of pressure at the moment. But if anyone tries to raise any political issue with him whatsoever, his answer is, look at how well we've done with the vaccine program, and we're leading the world in the vaccine program. And literally, you can ask him about anything, and that's him and his government's response to it. So it's difficult to know where we are exactly with that local based thing. But I mean, it just very much around where I live, it seems to be dying a death. It doesn't stop. The momentum for it doesn't seem to be carried on.
One question that I have in general is, how far these developments and these often quite temporary aspirations for communities and for people to, often kind of make do with a less than satisfactory circumstance by doing something productive in the local community, how far those initiatives will continue beyond the pandemic. And of course, we can only speculate about that. But a few people have tried to speculate about that, and that's kind of interesting in the writings.
Well, actually, that's a nice segue to one of the questions in the Q&A from David Lyon. David says, your evidence seems to suggest that at the same time as some forms of communitarian interest are on the rise, there are also signs of greater globalism, cosmopolitanism, and spiritual religious activity. I'm interested in what form the latter take and how they might be related to the leaning towards, quote, community.
Yeah, I think those are good questions. And I think perhaps the common factor would be the breach or the opportunity that's given through extreme circumstances, through necessity, and through an extraordinary set of times for people to step back from their current situation and to ask perhaps somewhat deeper questions. And that certainly would explain or express the kind of interest in the deeper interest in the spiritual, the contemplative, and perhaps the religious. It would also express a kind of deeper concern that people have to, and that's expressed in some of these writings, to not take each other for granted, and to treat people, treat families, treat communities, treat the people that you work with and that who provide for you with a deeper dignity and respect. And that is related often to people who are around you, and that is the kind of essence of the communitarian. But I'm with those people in terms of analytical frameworks who say that the deepest form of globalism is actually a deep love and respect for the local and the particular. It's just generalized to other places, and it's generalized to the entire humanity. So I don't know. I'm not sure that. I mean, David's question is excellent, but I don't want to sort of go too far beyond where the evidence takes us. But I do think that that's fairly evident from things that I've read, that people who support the local, the community-based, would not be averse to a kind of openness to the well-being of a broader world.
Jim, did you want to add something to that?
No, I'm fine with that. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, Queen's, you two don't notice, but Queen's has an unusual time that an hour is 50 minutes. So classes usually end either 20 past or 10 to, and we're a little over that.
All right.
So with that, I will say thank you both very much for your presentation. I think you've given us lots to think about. And also, I mean, the dynamic of predictive and prescriptive, I think, is really intriguing, and I think quite fruitful for further lines of inquiry. I was also really happy that in an age when there's so much pessimism, your research and your data seems to be rather optimistic about the future, and that's good. So
Yeah.
I will, on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your research with us, and I look forward to hearing more about it in the future.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. And just to say that I would welcome, this has been a great experience, but it's been kind of a one-way thing as opposed to being face-to-face. And I would welcome anybody's further comments. Just send me, please, a message through Queen's email. PNL is the handle at Queen's U. And I would gladly respond to any requests or any communications in that way. Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan.
My pleasure. And just a reminder that the next policy talk, studies talk, is Wednesday at noon, and that is called COVID-19 and Public Policy 3.0. And it features some names everyone will recognize. The Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Ontario, Kieran Moore, and some local experts from the university. So I hope you join us then. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all later. Take care.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you.
Cheers. Nice to meet you, Jim. Bye-bye.
Yeah, cheers.